Welcome to the debate. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning. It's August 13th, 1961. You're in Berlin. You hear the rumble of trucks, the screech of pneumatic drills, the shouting of soldiers. You look out your window, and right there, cutting through the heart of your city, they are tearing up the pavement, they are unrolling barbed wire. By the time the sun is fully up, your world has been sliced in two.
It's one of the most cinematic and terrifying moments of the 20th century. And for the next 28 years, that barrier wasn't just a pile of bricks or some utilitarian structure. It was the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain.
Absolutely. We are, of course, talking about the Berlin Wall. And today we aren't just recounting the timeline for the sake of it. We're digging into the why. Specifically, for those of you looking at the causes and consequences of this event, we have a central tension to resolve.
And it's a tension that usually gets glossed over in the simple, good versus evil narrative.
Right. The question is this. Was the construction of the Berlin Wall purely a desperate admission of ideological failure by the East? A prison built because the Soviet system was collapsing and simply couldn't keep its people, or
was it a calculated, rational, and you could even argue successful strategic maneuver that prevented a nuclear war and stabilized Europe?
I'm going to argue the former. To me, the wall was the ultimate proof of the moral and economic bankruptcy of the Soviet system. It was a prison, plain and simple, built to stop a brain drain that was bleeding East Germany dry.
And I am going to take the, perhaps unpopular, but historically necessary view that from a geopolitical standpoint, the wall was a success. It was a necessary response to Western economic warfare and subversion. It solved the Berlin crisis and created a kind of political permafrost that kept the Cold War cold.
Political permafrost, I like that term, even if I disagree with the sentiment. But let's get into the evidence, and I think we have to start with the why. You just can't understand the wall without looking at the sheer scale of the human exodus occurring in the years before.
You're referring to the migration statistics.
I am. If you look at the data in Source 23, the numbers are, frankly, staggering. Between 1949, when the GDR, East Germany, was formed, and 1961, 2.7 million East Germans fled to the West.
Just pause on that number for a second. 2.7 million.
It is roughly 1/6 of the entire population of the country. I mean, imagine if 1 out of every 6 people in your country just packed up and left. And they weren't just leaving, they were voting with their feet. They were rejecting the system.
I'm not disputing the raw numbers. It was a mass migration. But I think we need to look at the quality of that migration, not just the quantity, to understand the panic in the East.
Exactly. Source 23 highlights that these refugees were disproportionately young, well-educated, and highly skilled. We're talking about engineers, teachers, doctors, skilled craftsmen. This wasn't just a demographic shift, it was a brain drain in the most literal sense.
Right. The GDR pays for their education, which was free in the East, and then the moment they get their degree, they hop on the U-Bahn to West Berlin and get a job with Siemens or Volkswagen.
It was an existential threat. The GDR wasn't just losing bodies, they were losing their future. If that trend had continued, the East German economy wouldn't have just struggled, it would have collapsed entirely. No economy can survive losing its best and brightest at that rate.
I agree that the state was in crisis, but this is where our interpretations diverge. You see a state failing its people, and the people fleeing tyranny. I see a state under siege.
Under siege? They were leaving voluntarily.
Were they? Or were they being lured? We have to look at what West Berlin actually represented. It wasn't just a showcase of liberty by some happy accident. It was an artificial creation. It was funded by the Marshall Plan, massive injections of American cash, and supported by the CIA. It was designed specifically to be a glittering advertisement for capitalism right in the middle of the drastic austerity of the Soviet zone.
So you're suggesting the prosperity of West Berlin was a weapon?
Absolutely. Look at Source 26. This is the official Soviet explanation for the wall in 1961. They didn't frame it as stopping refugees. They framed it as securing the border against subversive activity. They called West Berlin an espionage center.
Espionage center. It sounds very James Bond.
It sounds like a movie, but historians know this wasn't just paranoia. The West used Berlin as a recruitment hub for spies, for sabotage, and for provoking disturbances within the Soviet bloc. The border was wide open. You could walk across, meet a handler, get paid, and walk back.
That sounds a lot like the party line used to justify a crackdown. We aren't locking you in, we're keeping the bad guys out. It's a convenient excuse, isn't it? To cover up the fact that people simply wanted to leave?
Well, it feels like an excuse to us now, but place yourself in the Kremlin in 1961. The West was actively using that open border to squeeze the Soviets' fear. My argument is that the wall was about sovereignty. No state can tolerate an open border where a hostile opposing system is actively undermining its currency and its economy. It was a brutal solution, yes, but it was a rational solution to an untenable situation. It wasn't just about trapping people, it was about stopping the West from bleeding the East dry.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it ignores the lived reality of the people on the ground. You make it sound like an abstract game of chess, but for the people, it was about bread, butter, and freedom. But let's move into the core debate and really break this down. We need to talk about that economic disparity you mentioned. You called West Berlin artificial, but for the average Berliner, the contrast was very, very real.
Let's do that. Because the economics are the key to the rational argument.
West Berlin was filled with shops, consumer goods, neon lights, Western music, fresh fruit. It was a modern, thriving city. East Berlin faced shortages, rationing, gray concrete, and restriction. The source material mentions the irony of that 1959 Soviet cartoon, Source 21.
Ah, yes. The one with the stallion and the donkey?
That's the one. It's almost comical in hindsight. The cartoon shows a strong, leaping horse representing the East, the socialist stallion, and a sluggish, tired donkey for the West. The caption read, "The socialist stallion far outclasses the capitalist donkey."
It's a classic piece of Soviet bravado. We will bury you, as Khrushchev said.
It's delusional. The Soviet propaganda machine was trying to claim their system was superior, but the reality on the street was the exact opposite. Walter Ulbricht, the East German leader, promised in 1961 that the GDR would surpass West Germany's standard of living. I mean, that was a fantasy. The wall was built because the socialist stallion had broken its leg.
That's a vivid image, but I think you're missing the mechanics of why the stallion was stumbling. You're comparing two economies, but you aren't acknowledging that one was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The open border created a bizarre economic anomaly. As one East Berliner noted in the texts, it was a crazy system.
Okay, explain this crazy system to me. How does an open border destroy an economy?
Okay, imagine this. You live in East Berlin. Because it's a communist state, your rent is heavily subsidized by the government. It costs you almost nothing. Your bread, your milk, your basic utilities, your tram ticket, all subsidized. The state pays for it.
Right? That's the benefit of the system.
But you cross the street to work in West Berlin,
Where the wages are higher.
much higher, and paid in a strong currency, the Deutschmark. So you earn high Western wages, you change that money on the black market for 5 times its value in East German marks, and then you go back home to the East and live like a king on the cheap subsidized economy. They were called Grenzgänger, border crossers.
So you're saying the East was effectively subsidizing the West's workforce.
Precisely. The East was paying for their housing and food, and the West was getting their labor. Plus, the open border allowed the West to weaponize their currency against the GDR. It created a situation where the East German mark became worthless. The West knew this. They knew that by keeping West Berlin as this glittering advertisement, as you call it, they were destabilizing the entire Eastern Bloc currency. The wall, from an economic strategist's point of view, was a defensive measure to stop this currency arbitrage.
That is a very technical defense for something that resulted in people being shot for trying to cross the street.
It is technical, but if you're studying this period, you have to understand it. It wasn't just communism is bad at business. It was that you cannot run two opposing economic systems with a completely porous border. It breaks the math.
Even if I grant you the economic crazy system, it doesn't excuse the method of the solution. You fix currency arbitrage with fiscal policy, not with machine guns. This brings us to our second point of contention, the nature of the wall itself. Was it a protective shell, as the Soviets claimed, or was it a prison?
I think we know where you stand on this.
It is hard to stand anywhere else when you look at the physical reality described in the texts. We aren't just talking about a fence. By the time it was fully developed, it was a concrete block wall, 12 feet high, nearly 100 miles long, encircling the entire city.
It was a militarized border, no question.
It was a death strip. It had guard towers, anti-vehicle trenches, fakir beds of spikes, and police dogs. And most damning of all, the shoot-to-kill orders.
The order to fire on anyone attempting to breach the perimeter.
Correct. Over the next 3 decades, hundreds of people were killed. Source 24 shows the chaos of families divided, babies being held up over the wire so grandparents could see them. Source 25 shows East German guards recovering the body of a man shot attempting to cross.
It's brutal imagery.
It's more than imagery, it's a moral indictment. Even Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, admitted in private that it was a hateful thing. If the architect of the policy calls it hateful, how can you defend it as a protective shell?
Because I'm looking at the alternative. And this is crucial for anyone trying to understand the Cold War. You have to contextualize this within the summer of 1961. We were on the brink of World War III.
You think the wall prevented a war?
I think the historical record supports that, yes. Remember the context. In 1958, Khrushchev issued his ultimatum. He was threatening to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would cut off Western access to Berlin entirely. He was trying to push the Americans, British, and French out of the city.
This was the Berlin crisis.
Exactly. For 3 years, the world was holding its breath. There was constant friction. The West was pushing, the East was pushing back. The border was this fuzzy line where conflict could spark at any moment. Khrushchev famously said, "Berlin is the testicles of the West. When I want the West to scream, I squeeze on Berlin."
A charming metaphor.
Vivid, though. But it shows the danger. But once the concrete was poured on August 13th, the lines were drawn.
So the wall created clarity?
Paradoxically, yes. The immediate threat of a direct Soviet-American war over Berlin vanished. Look at Source 28, the Soviet cartoon. It depicts the wall as a shield with the caption, "The border of the GDR is closed to all enemies." Now that is propaganda, yes, but strategically, it functioned as a shell. It allowed the East German state to consolidate. It stopped the bleeding. As President Kennedy himself said, and you quoted him earlier, but you missed this part, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war."
That quote from Kennedy is telling, but I interpret it as resignation, not approval. He was relieved he didn't have to push the nuclear button, sure. But that brings us to the third and perhaps most important point, the geopolitical effects. You argue it was a success because it stabilized Europe. I argue it was an ideological defeat of colossal proportions.
Colossal proportions is a strong phrase.
It's not mine, it's from the historian David Painter in Source B. He argues that the wall became concrete evidence that Soviet-style socialism was losing the competition. Think about it. Before the wall, there was a theoretical debate about which system was better, communism or capitalism. Intellectuals in Paris and London could argue about the merits of Marxism.
Sure.
After the wall, the debate was over. Because if you have to lock your people in to keep them from leaving, you have lost the moral argument. You have admitted that your system cannot compete in the marketplace of ideas or economics. As the Hungarian communist leader János Kadar predicted, it caused grave damage to the reputation of communism globally. It made the Soviet bloc look weak and terrified of its own citizens.
Moral argument, perhaps, but in the Cold War, moral arguments didn't stop tanks. Strategic arguments did. I'm looking at Source A from historian Martin Walker. He notes that the Berlin crisis was followed by a prolonged period of stability. He uses the phrase political permafrost.
Permafrost. I want to dig into that term. It implies something dead, frozen.
It implies something solid, stable, unchanging. The wall allowed the Soviet bloc to survive for another 28 years. That is not a failure in geopolitical terms. That is a lease on life. Without the wall, the GDR likely collapses in 1961. With the wall, it survives until 1989. It froze the conflict.
But let's look at that frozen conflict. It wasn't exactly peaceful. Look at the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie in October 1961. This is just a few months after the wall goes up.
The tank standoff.
American and Soviet tanks facing each other, engines running, guns loaded, just a few meters apart. One nervous tank commander sneezes, and you have World War III. That doesn't feel like stability to me. That feels like the end of the world.
It was a terrifying moment. But notice what happened. They didn't fire. Why? Because the wall had already defined the limits. The Soviets had their side. The Americans had theirs. Both sides eventually backed their tanks up, inch by inch. The wall created a status quo that both superpowers could live with. It transformed a potential nuclear flashpoint into a static, manageable stalemate.
But at what cost? You speak of the GDR surviving for 28 years as a success. I argue those were 28 years of stagnation. The wall didn't solve the underlying economic problems, it just hid them behind concrete. As Bradley Lightbody points out in Source C, the Soviet Union was humbled by the construction. It proved that peaceful coexistence had failed.
I wouldn't say humbled, I'd say pragmatic. They realized they couldn't win the economic game with an open board, so they changed the rules.
But the wall became the world's most vivid demonstration of communist failure. Every time a Western leader visited, Kennedy with Ich bin ein Berliner, Reagan with tear down this wall, they stood in front of that structure and pointed to it. It was a PR disaster that never went away. It delegitimized the entire Eastern Bloc. It was a constant reminder that the system didn't work.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the PR disaster outweighed the strategic gain. If the GDR had collapsed in 1961, the humiliation would have been far worse and the risk of war far higher. The Soviets were pragmatic. They chose a hateful thing over a lost cause. And let's be honest, the West was relieved too.
Relieved? That's a cynical take.
Is it? There is a strong historical argument that the West preferred the wall to the uncertainty of a collapsing East Germany. It provided clarity. As Source A says, Europe settled down into its two armed camps. It was ugly, it was brutal, but it was stable. And in the nuclear age, stability is the most valuable currency there is. The West could point to the wall and say, look how bad they are. But they could also go to sleep at night knowing the borders were fixed.
I see your point about stability, and strictly from a realpolitik perspective, maybe you're right. But I cannot divorce the geopolitics from the human reality. The stability was built on the suppression of millions of people. It was built on the backs of those who were shot in the death strip.
And I would argue that freedom for West Berlin was built on the artificial propping up of an economy to serve as a weapon. Both sides were playing a game. The wall just made the rules of that game visible and concrete.
Let's bring this to a conclusion. We've covered a lot of ground here. The brain drain of the 1950s, the economic warfare, and the crazy system of the Grenzgänger, the physical reality of the border, and the long-term geopolitical fallout.
We have. And it's a complex picture. It's not just bricks and mortar.
From my perspective, despite your arguments about stability, the wall remains the ultimate symbol of failure. While it might have bought the East German government time, those 28 years you mentioned, it did so at the cost of its soul. It was a short-term fix for a systemic economic failure that ultimately couldn't be hidden behind concrete. It confirmed to the world that communism could only exist through coercion. As Kennedy said, we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
And from my perspective, in the ruthless calculus of the Cold War, the wall was a strategic success. It stopped the West from squeezing the Eastern Bloc to death in 1961. It transformed a volatile open wound in Berlin into a scar. Ugly, yes, but healed over enough to prevent a nuclear infection. It froze the map of Europe and prevented World War III. It bought the Soviet Union 3 decades of survival.
It seems we are left with the dual nature of the Cold War itself. The wall was a stabilizing mechanism for the superpowers, ensuring they didn't blow up the world.
But it was a tragedy for the individuals trapped behind it. A shield for the state, a cage for the citizen.
Precisely. For those of you listening, especially if you are revising for your exams, I encourage you to look at the data in Source 23 regarding the refugees. Look at the numbers of professionals leaving, and look at the quotes in Source 27 from President Kennedy. Weigh the human cost against the geopolitical stability.
And look at Source 26.
Try to understand the Soviet mindset of being under siege. It explains why they felt the wall was their only option, even if you disagree with the morality of it.
Was it a shield or a cage? That is for you to decide. Thank you for listening to The Debate.
Goodbye.